We say things like, maybe later, perhaps another time, or I'll see you tomorrow. But for some of us, there won't be a tomorrow. Listen as your worst nightmares come to life. These nightmares have become someone's reality. My name is Justin Crowley, and this is The Murder Project. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of The Murder Project. In this episode, we're going to be looking at a case that is a little bit different from some of the other ones we've previously discussed. And by that, I mean that it doesn't seem like this case was going to be going in the direction that it did, but you never know what's going to happen. This is a story about two friends who set out on an adventure to travel across country, but ultimately they would find themselves in a situation they feared they could not get out of. And at the end of it, someone is going to end up dead. Strap in, ladies and gentlemen, because episode 13 starts right now. It was the end of July in 1999, and two friends, best buds, David Coughlin and Raffi Kodikian, had just graduated from college in Boston, Massachusetts. David and Raffi had met each other while they were in college, and they remained best friends basically the whole time. After they graduated from college, David decided that he was going to continue his education, and he was going to move to California to attend UC Santa Barbara. Now, David had asked Raffi if he would accompany him on a cross-country trip, if you will. They were going to leave Boston, Massachusetts and drive to California and stop at a lot of different places on the way. It's kind of a cross-country journey. Raffi told David that he wouldn't have time because he had some work schedule conflicts and he didn't think that he was going to be able to make it. David really wanted Raffi to go on this trip with him, so he kind of kept pushing it out a little bit and moving the trip back little by little. Now, Raffi wanted to go on the trip, but as I mentioned, he couldn't, so he helped David kind of get the details together for the trip. Kind of helped him plan out the stops and things like that. But as it got closer to time, and because David kept pushing the trip out a little bit, Raffi was able to join him. So the two set out from Boston, Massachusetts on their way to California, and they stopped at various locations, including Tennessee, and after Tennessee they went down to New Orleans, Louisiana, which I imagine was a great time. And after New Orleans, they drove over to Austin, Texas, and spent a little time there. And from Austin, they were going to continue heading west and decided that their next overnight stop was going to be in the area of Carlsbad, New Mexico. Now, Carlsbad, New Mexico is an area that I am really familiar with. It's semi-close to where I grew up. I also spent a lot of time there when I worked in the oil field. There's a lot of oil field traffic that goes through Carlsbad. And one of the main attractions that is in Carlsbad is, of course, the Carlsbad Caverns, which is a part of the Carlsbad Caverns National Park. So the two headed out, and once they got to Carlsbad, they stopped in the area and decided that they were going to go ahead and check out Carlsbad Caverns National Park. And if you haven't been to the caverns, it's a really cool place, in my opinion. It is a giant cave that you can pay an admission fee to and walk down into this cave and check out all of the kind of cool rock formations and things like that that are down inside of it. It takes a pretty good amount of time. You're walking downhill mostly, but it does have a pretty well made ramp going all the way down, and it's quite interesting. If this is not sort of your thing, basically what it would be is taking an hour and a half to walk down into a really big hole and then taking an elevator out and leaving. I remember going to the Carlsbad Caverns whenever I was a kid. And then when I worked in the oil field, I had a stopover in Carlsbad one night, and I finished my work a little bit early, so I went over and checked it out again as an adult, and it was just as cool as I remember it being. I've never stayed at the actual national park, but I imagine that it is quite hot, especially depending on what time of the year that you go there. Now for Raffi and David, they got to the park on August 4th. So it's going to be full-blown summertime weather down there. Temperatures are going to be around 100 degrees. It's going to make it feel hotter than that because of the climate. Raffi and David, when they got to Carlsbad, they stopped at a convenience store and they were trying to figure out where exactly that they were going to camp at. I don't know. I did not find out if they actually went into the caverns, but I do know that when they talked to a gentleman inside the convenience store, the clerk, he mentioned Carlsbad Caverns National Park, said it was a really cool place. And so the two decided that they were going to go ahead and have that as their overnight. They did not know anything about the area that they were in. They were not experienced campers, and they most certainly were not experienced desert campers because the climate and terrain is going to be different, and you need to definitely be prepared before you go into an area like this. One of the things that they did do is they bought a topography map so that they would be able to figure out what was in the area. The only problem with that is that neither Raffi nor David knew how to read a topography map. And if you don't know what that is, I suggest you looking it up. I'll try to explain as best I can, but the visual would definitely be better than my explanation. But if you've ever seen one of these maps, it's kind of a colorful picture map, bird's eye view. It has of course, legend on the map so that you know what the symbols and everything mean. It'll give you a kind of a measurement reading so that you know that an inch on the page equals, say, half a mile or 100 feet or whatever the distance is on that map. The bigger the map and the more broad the area is, the more it would actually be, like, say, a mile, 2 miles, 5 miles. If you have a map that is focused on a select area, 1 inch may represent 100 feet. It just depends. It also has circles and lines, kind of weird shaped circles, weird lines, and it'll give you the elevation change on the map about every 5th line, I believe. If you see an area where there is smaller circles that look like they're kind of a circled area that's getting smaller as it goes in, that might indicate that you're going to a mountainside or larger hillside, and the incline is going to be going up. It'll also show you ridge lines, valleys, areas that might have vegetation, all those kinds of things. However, if you don't know how to read one of these maps, it's going to look like a whole bunch of squiggly lines and very confusing. So I can imagine for David and Raffi, they got the map and they assumed they would be able to figure out how to read it. However, I don't think that either one of those gentlemen ever did actually figure out how to read that map. So after they figured out that they were going to go, they bought some supplies, I guess, from the convenience store. And from what I understand, it did not consist of much. It was 3 bottles of water. The research I did shows 3 pints of water. So 3 16-ounce bottles and 1 16-ounce bottle of Gatorade. And if you're thinking to yourself, for 2 people, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, you would be absolutely correct, because that is not a whole lot of supplies. But to their defense, they were probably thinking because they were only going to spend 1 night at this location, they did not need much. But I will tell you, in areas like this, especially where I'm from, we have the Paladuro Canyon State Park. It gets very hot out there, and it is in a very deep canyon, And if you're going to go on, say, a 5-mile, 7-mile hike, it is recommended that you bring at least a gallon of water per person. And in my opinion, I think you should always bring supplies or water than you think you might need. So Raffi and David bought the 3 bottles of water, the 1 bottle of Gatorade. They also bought some hot dog weenies and a few cans of beans, and they set off for Carlsbad Cavern National Park. When they arrived, they decided that they were going to go down into Rattlesnake Canyon, and that's where they were going to hike out and camp. So they drove down to Rattlesnake Canyon trailhead and parked their car. I looked at the area on Google Maps just to kind of refresh myself, and it looked like there were some dirt roads leading out there to the trailhead. There's not a whole lot as far as any sort of amenities that you would probably think, because it's a national park area and it's a camping area, but it's definitely not glamorous by any means. So after they get to the trailhead, they decide, it's about 4 p.m., they decide that they are going to camp about a mile away from where they parked at the trailhead. And these were not designated camp areas. They would be, by all means, quote unquote, roughing it. They walked out, set up camp, and kind of settled in for the night. So after they set up camp, they decide to go ahead and have their dinner for the night. Each of them, I believe, drink one of their bottles of water that they had, and then they used their last bottle of water to boil the hot dog weenies that they brought. Now, this seems very strange to me, and for all we know, maybe there was a burn ban that was in effect, or they had to use a cooking stove instead of a fire. But I was kind of thinking, that seems strange to me to boil hot dog weenies while you're out camping. That's definitely something that I've never heard of or witnessed myself. I do a lot of camping, or I used to. I really enjoy it, and boiling hot dog weenies on a camping trip would definitely be a first for me if I saw it. However, they have their dinner, they kind of settle in for the night. The next morning, they wake up and they decide that they're going to pack up and leave. However, neither one of them can figure out which direction they need to go to get back to their car. Now, I looked at some of the trails on there, and it seemed kind of like a one-way in, one-way out type scenario. But like any area like this, all of these trails usually have splits in them where they split off to different areas. So if you're not familiar, it is definitely easy to get confused and turned around, especially because there are no landmarks that they are familiar with. Now, the type of terrain that these two are going to be in at the time is going to consist of what they called a desert-like environment, but you're not looking at, say, sand. This is going to be an area that does have, dirt, rocks, and sand, some larger rocks, trees, shrubs, some shrubs that are kind of thorny. You're going to have cactus and prairie grass. So they take off from the camp area to see if they can try and figure out where exactly they are. And they are unsuccessful for this whole entire day. It may not seem like that long, and they haven't been out there very long, just overall in general. But one thing that we have to remember is that by this second day, as we'll call it, August 4th was the first day that they were out there. This is August 5th. They have now wandered around out in Rattlesnake Canyon, and we have to assume that their Gatorade is gone by now, and they only had the 3 original bottles of water, which are also all gone. It's very hot in this area, as I mentioned, so they're going to be sweating a lot. They're going to be using a lot of energy walking up and down these kind of hillside areas. It's not really mountainous, but it is some pretty steep hillsides. And they're not taking in any extra calories because they don't even have any food left. Or what little food they have left is not going to replenish the calories that they are burning while they're out here. So after they wander around for the entire day and unable to use the topographical map that they bought, they mosey back to their campsite and they bed down for the night and decide that they are going to take another crack at it the following day. That night, I don't know if they or what they saw, but both of the guys, Raffi and David, thought that they saw headlights driving above them on this hill area. So they thought that there might be a road up there somewhere that they could get to possibly the next day, flag somebody down, or use the roadway to find a ranger station or something like that. So they both decide that the next morning they're going to get up and try to walk up this very steep hill and find the roadway. So when they get up the following morning, they start their hike up this hill. And Raffi said that every time they thought they got to the top of the hill, it just seemed to keep going. And this is an important part because if they would have known how to read that map, this would have been that description I gave to you earlier about the circles that were getting smaller as they seem like they're kind of stacking up on top of each other. They probably would have been able to figure out how much elevation they would have had to climb and approximately how long it might take them. Now, when they're going through this, when they're climbing up this hill, they have to go through all the elements of their surroundings, which are, like I said, the large rocks, the cactus, the prickly bushes, and things like that. So you're probably going to get scraped up or cut, or, you could fall down, you could roll an ankle. There's definitely a lot of areas where you could be injured in something like this. But once they make it to the top of the hill, they figure out that there is no road. What they thought they saw was not, in fact, anything. I'm not sure what exactly they assumed the car lights were or what that possibly could have been. But when they got to the top of the hill, they realized that it was nothing. Now, later on, one of the park rangers would say that if Raffi and David made it to the top of this hill, they could have clearly seen the direction that they needed to go to get back to the road, or possibly the trailhead where they parked their car, or even a ranger station. But from what Raffi said, he and David were unable to locate any landmarks of any kind that they thought could get them to safety. They decide to walk back down the hill, and as they are making their way down the hill, they do spot a old abandoned ranch style home, is what it's described as. And I'm not sure exactly, I was not able to find any information on this small ranch home, but what I can assume is that it is a very old home that probably was abandoned a long time ago and did not have anything that could possibly help the boys except for perhaps shelter from the elements, from the sun. After making their way down to the abandoned ranch home, they start to have doubts about their situation and how things might end for both of them. And this is unfortunate because I know that when people get in desperate situations, they start thinking desperately. And these two guys are certainly in the mode of desperation by this point. They still don't have any water. They still don't have any food. They're still burning tons of calories. They're still sweating a lot. And they have nothing to replenish their body with. Dehydration is, if it hasn't already, going to be setting in, and that is going to put them into a situation where they are going to be even more desperate and more uncertain about their future and what is going to happen to them. It also says that buzzards had already started flying around them. Buzzards are a carnivorous bird, and it usually signals when you see them that there is death around or something is about to die, and when it does, they're going to swoop in and eat it. Now, Raffi and Dave make it back to their campsite again, after they were unsuccessful in finding a way out of the canyon. And this is one of the things that I thought was interesting when I was reading about it, is that the fact that David and Raffi could not find their way out to safety, but they could always find their way back to their camp. And I kind of found that interesting, and I didn't know if they were walking in circles or if they were kind of just walking blind and they would go straight down a path and straight back, but for some reason they could always find their way back to their campsite. So once they get back to their campsite, they stay the night there again. They wake up on the third day, and at this point, Raffi and David do not think that they are going to be saved. They think that they had sealed their fate out on Rattlesnake Canyon, and this would be ultimately where they both perish. Now, one of the things that they did while they were out there to try to get any sort of water or nourishment, from what I can understand, is they were licking rocks and also eating prickly pears. And if you're unsure of what a prickly pear is, in the research I did, it was often referred to as cactus fruit. Now, being from this area, I have never heard of it referred to as cactus fruit, but that does not mean that it's not referred to as that. I've just always heard it called prickly pears. And the thing about prickly pears is that you can eat them, and I guess they can help you in some sort of way, especially if you're as desperate and dehydrated as these two are. But you have to make sure that the prickly pears that you eat are ripe. And the way you'll know that they're ripe is they have a kind of a sweet taste to them. I've had prickly pear jam before, but obviously it's probably going to have some added sugar in there. And I don't ever recall just eating a prickly pear when I was a child because they always had thorns in them. One of the ways that you can tell if they're not ripe is they taste very bitter. And if you eat a bitter prickly pear, it is best to not swallow it and spit it out because it will not settle well in your stomach. It will give you stomach cramps. It will cause nausea that can make you vomit, and it can also give you diarrhea. And if you are in a situation where you are already dehydrated, vomiting and diarrhea can most certainly be your worst enemies, aside from the sun and the heat that is literally just trying to kill you. David got into some unripe prickly pears and ate them anyways, and he started vomiting and having abdominal cramps and things related to the symptoms that I just said, and he feared the worst. He thought that this was ultimately going to be the end for him. He was suffering a lot. He was dehydrated, and I don't think David or Raffi were thinking clearly because of the exposure that they had and the dehydration that they were experiencing. As the third day moves on, David and Raffi decide that it might be time for them to make a suicide pact, because neither one of them wants to go through the suffering of dehydration. They don't want to have to die in this painful way. And so they think to themselves that the only way they can get out of this is through suicide. And both of them seem to be very weak. And I read that while they made this suicide pact, they decided that they were going to use Raffi's folding pocket knife to cut their wrists, but it stated that neither one of them were strong enough because of the dehydration to carry this out. And I think unless the pocket knife was really dull, even in the condition that they're in, they could have at least done something with it. But that's not for me to decide. It's obvious that it did not happen because neither one of them died by suicide. As the night continues, David is in excruciating pain. He cannot stop vomiting, and by this time he is vomiting up his own stomach bile, and he thinks that death is right around the corner. Raffi tries to get David to sit up, and he is comforting David, but every time that David sits up, he starts to vomit again, and so he can't do anything but lay down. Both the guys, David and Raffi, decide that they need to go ahead and write notes to their loved ones, and they both wrote goodbye letters in this notebook. And I believe one of the two, I believe Raffi, had also been journaling in this notebook while they were stuck out there this whole time. So it kind of had a play-by-play while they were stuck out in Rattlesnake Canyon. Raffi says that David woke up probably around 5 or 6 in the morning. I guess at some point they had been able to get a little bit of rest through all of this. When David woke up, he told Raffi that basically he had had enough, that he knew he was going to die. He knew that the park rangers were not going to find them. Raffi agreed that he did not think that they were going to be found. They both thought that they were going to die out here or out there. And David told Raffi that he was too weak to kill himself, and that David needed Raffi to put him out of his misery, essentially. He said that he did not want to go through the next 12 to 24 hours feeling the way that he did, and he knew in his heart that at this point nothing was going to save him. So he wanted Raffi to put him out of his misery. When Raffi and David started discussing this, Raffi asked him how he wanted it done, and David told Raffi that he should just take his 4-inch folding knife, his pocket knife, and stab him in the chest. Plunge the knife down into his chest and put him out of his misery. Now, Raffi did not want to do this, but David convinced him that it was the most humane thing that could possibly happen to him in the situation that they're in. So Raffi pulled out his 4-inch folding knife, opened it up, and David said to Raffi something along the lines of, just do it, but make sure you don't mess it up. So Raffi takes the knife, he plunges it down into David's chest. Raffi asked him if he was still alive, and he says yes. And then there is some talk about Raffi needing to try again. So Raffi pulls the knife out, he pulls back, he plunges the knife down into David's chest for the second time, and this time, he was unaware of this at the time, but on the second try, Raffi hits David in the heart. Later in an autopsy, it would show that on the first attempt, David was hit in his lung, and on the second attempt, he was hit in his heart. After Raffi plunges the knife into David for the second time, he said, "Are you in any pain?" And he said, "No." Raffi pulls the knife out and sees blood coming from the wound. At this point, he knows that he probably got a good hit on David. He asked David if he was still alive. He says yes. And Raffi tells him that he is going to cover his face and mouth to maybe help him pass more quickly. And from what Raffi says, David just says, okay. A few moments later, David expires, and Raffi realizes that he cannot bury David in the desert, and so he wants to kind of give him a different type of burial because he does not want his best friend eaten by buzzards. Oddly enough, Raffi being dehydrated and malnourished, he is able to assemble a large amount of rocks and not boulders, but larger rocks, and cover David's entire body. And he makes this kind of rock covering over David that's about 3 foot wide by 7 feet long, and covers his entire body. And from the research I did, it showed that he had lifted some of the rocks that were 50 all the way up to 70 pounds to cover him. And he may be at this point running on adrenaline, but for some reason in this dehydrated, malnourished state, he is still able to pick up these large rocks and assemble them over David's body to make a makeshift grave. After David is killed and buried, Raffi decides that he is going to attempt his life again. However, at this point, he also mentions that he is not strong enough to cut his wrists, so he just sits there. To Raffi's surprise, and I think to the surprise of the park rangers, the park rangers, stumble across Raffi about 3 to 4 hours after he has just killed his best friend, the guy that he had known for several years and had become really good friends with, the guy that just a few days earlier was excited to move to California and continue his studies. I believe it was in economics, but he primarily was focusing on being a traffic policy analysis, which sounds wildly boring to me, but to each their own. And Raffi himself was going to be and was a aspiring journalist. That was something that he cared about deeply, and that was the area that he wanted to work in. And so these two college graduates, David going to get his master's, I would assume. David is now dead, and Raffi is now being rescued and finds himself in a very different situation. Raffi wrote in his journal after he killed David, quote, "I killed and buried my best friend today. David had been in pain all night. Around 5 or 6, he turned to me and begged that I put my knife through his chest. I did. And a second time when he wouldn't die." End quote. When the park rangers found Raffi, they said, "Hey, where's your friend?" And at this moment, I believe that the park rangers were semi-familiar with the two because they checked into at the ranger station when they came into the park, and they only bought a one-day pass. This was one of the things that Raffi and David thought would help them out, because they knew that when the park rangers found their car at the trailhead, they would see that they only had a one-day pass, and they would know that possibly something bad had happened to them, or they were trying to skip out on the additional fees, and so they would come find them. And when they couldn't find them, they would start a search. Now, this did happen, but it did not happen in the time that I think Raffi and David were hoping for. The park ranger asks Raffi, "Where's your friend?" He tells him that he killed him, and that's what he says. Park ranger says, "Where's your friend at?" He says, "He's over there." He points to the pile of rocks that is just to the side of him or behind him and says, "He's over there." And when the park ranger says, "Where?" he says, "He's under the rocks. I buried him. I killed him." And so this is the first thing that the park rangers are hearing after they find Raffi. So they go over and look, and sure enough, David is buried under this pile of rocks. And so they call for air support to help get Raffi out of the canyon, because they see that he is in a severe state, or what they thought was a severe state of dehydration. Raffi is airlifted out of the canyon and taken to the hospital. Now, the interesting thing about when Raffi gets to the hospital is after he's given some water by the park rangers while he's waiting, and IVs when he gets to the hospital, it's said that he is released from the hospital about an hour or two after he arrived. So this got me thinking that perhaps he wasn't in as bad of dehydration as he thought he was, or, which is also possible, he recovered very quickly. And that is something that we should definitely look at, because it is absolutely a possibility that he just rebounded and recovered a lot quicker than some people might, or some people might think. Now, after Raffi was released from the hospital, he was not released into the custody of his friends or family. He was released into the custody of law enforcement because the park rangers notified the local law enforcement and told them of the situation that happened, and Raffi was arrested for the murder of his best bud, David. Now, when Raffi went to see a magistrate or a judge, the judge set his bond from what I can see. It says $50,000 cash bond, which seems like a whole lot of money, and it is. But in situations like this, there is definitely something for me at least, that thinks that maybe he set the bond at a $500,000 cash or surety bond, and in both situations you're required to put up 10%. That is what it is in the state of Texas. I'm not sure what it is in New Mexico, but I would assume that it's fairly close because the $50,000 cash bond. So Raffi's dad is actually able to come up with the $50,000 cash bond, and Raffi is released from jail, and he goes back to Pennsylvania with his family, which is where he is originally from. Now, once he gets back to Pennsylvania, the police start going to work trying to figure out if this was what everybody that I've heard refers to as a mercy killing, or if Raffi murdered his friend David in cold blood. And from what the police put together, they actually go up to Boston, Massachusetts, and possibly Pennsylvania, and talk to his friends, his family. They talk to Raffi's girlfriend or ex-girlfriend, and they are not able to find a single person that said that David and Raffi ever had any problems whatsoever. 0 problems. No fights, no arguments. Strangely, nothing. And when he is getting ready for trial, because he is ultimately indicted by a grand jury for second-degree murder, and when he is getting ready for trial, his attorneys try to say that his defense will be involuntary intoxication, which is very strange, right? Because he didn't have any alcohol or anything. And if you'll remember from our Alicia Bromfield case, that is the defense that her murderer used. If you also recall, they had that law changed, but this is 1999, so this is 8 years before Alicia Bromfield's case. Well, the judge is not going for the involuntary intoxication because, as we stated, there was no intoxicants involved. But Raffi's attorneys try to say that due to the dehydration, it put him in a state similar to what you would have with involuntary intoxication. But the judge said, "Nuh-uh, ain't gonna work," and he throws that out. Then they started to look at a avenue of possible some sort of insanity defense because of his dehydration. But all of these things had the potential to fall apart because Raffi rebounded so quickly from the hospital, and there were several doctors that were present when Raffi came in that said he was most definitely dehydrated, but he was not in a state of dehydration where he would have died soon. They also did an autopsy on David and found that although he was also dehydrated and was going through a lot of physical pain because of the prickly pears and other things that he ate, he was also not in a state of dehydration where he would have likely died soon. I failed to mention this earlier, but the two also tried to drink their own urine after they had been in the desert for 3 days. This kind of points to how desperate they were getting. And I'd also like to mention that you should not ever drink your own urine, especially if you get into a situation where you think you're dehydrated, because by the time you have the idea to drink your own urine, you're probably going to be in a state where your urine is going to be very yellow or golden colored, and there is absolutely no possible way that you will get any nutrients out of that, and you will only make yourself more sick. You will put yourself into a situation where you could vomit, and as we've just talked about, that is not good when you're already dehydrated. I also think it was interesting because they tried to filter their urine by peeing through a baseball cap into a bottle and then trying to drink the urine that way. And the reason I bring this up is because I think that kind of gives you a look inside what the state of mind of these two actually was and what they were thinking about and what they were going through. And then they get to the point where they think that the only way out of this is to kill themselves, which just turns into David being killed. So going back to the trial, Raffi decides that he is going to just take a plea deal because he doesn't want to take this to court and kind of roll the dice and see what happens. Although he does actually roll the dice because he pleads no contest, or as I've referred to it, nolo contendere. He pleads no contest and puts his fate in the hands of the judge. And when he pleads no contest, he is facing a sentence of up to 20 years. The DA's office says that they will be satisfied with half of that if they got him 10 years. But the judge does something interesting because I think he may have felt a little compassion for Raffi because, like I mentioned, they could not figure out and did not find anything that would lead them to believe that Raffi would do something like this, kill his friend in cold blood, that he had a motive for actual murder. But there is no defense for a sympathy or mercy killing in the state of New Mexico. So you can't say that he had a mercy killing and there is some sort of charge for that. There's just not. But the judge does have some compassion and sympathy for Raffi, and he gives him a 15-year sentence. And the 15-year sentence is what you would see on paper, but the judge decides that he is going to suspend 13 years of that 15-year sentence, and Raffi would only have to serve up to 2 years in prison with a 5-year parole period. Now, Raffi, when he goes to jail, he only ends up serving 16 months out of the possible 24 months that he received, and he gets put on parole or probation, whichever you refer to it as. It would technically be parole, but he is paroled for 5 years, and once he completes this 5-year parole, he is officially off paper and back to his normal and regular life, if you want to call it that. David's family did not harbor any ill will towards Raffi, and I think a lot of people understood the situation that they were in, or tried to. Some of the locals in the area where they were at did not have a similar opinion, and I think this might be because they knew the area, they knew the landscape, they were familiar with this type of camping scenario, and I don't think they showed Raffi any mercy. I'm sure some people did, but the consensus down there was that there was a different way that this should have been handled, and they thought that Raffi kind of got off lightly. Now, whether or not we agree with this situation, I don't think we can say Raffi killed his best friend out of anger or hatred or malice. We just can't see that. But more that he killed his friend out of mercy or sympathy. And whether we agree with that or not, I don't think we have anything that points to the contrary. But the good thing about this podcast is we've got a debrief coming, and we can really, Mike and I think, can really break this down. I'd like to use that opportunity to get into some of the scenarios that they might have been in, the topography map, because I haven't talked to Mike, but I know because he was in the military, he most certainly was trained how to use one, and the different scenarios that they got in, what the mindset was, and everything that kind of goes along with that. I can't wait to do the debrief with Mike, because both of us like camping type situations and being in those situations. So I think that it'll be a very good show. So make sure and tune in to that one, and I will see you guys next time. Goodbye. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to the episode. I'm glad that you guys are here and listening, and are supporting us by downloading the podcast and subscribing and doing all of those things. If you are looking for us on any of the social medias, we are on Facebook at The Murder Project. If you need to search for us, we are on facebook.com/podcasttmp. If you're searching for us on the Instagrams, we are at The Murder Project. And if you're looking for us on Twitter, we are at The Murder Pod. We also want to remind everyone that if you could please hit the like or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening on. It really helps us get past the algorithm, and for a podcast that's just starting out, that is huge, and it doesn't cost you anything. Also, if you're on Apple Podcast or any of those, make sure and hit 5 stars if you think we are worthy of it. We would appreciate it a whole lot. Leave us a comment, type something in there, let us know how we're doing. I'd love to read some of those comments out once we get a few more in there. So please, if you could, take a little bit of time and help us out. If you want to send us an email, you can always do that. Just type in contact@themurderproject.com and we will get that email directly. I can't wait to talk to you guys again on the debrief. Mike will be with me. We'll be discussing the case further. I can't wait to talk to you guys again. But until then, head up, eyes up, and stay alive.